Record. There we go. Now we are recording. And I am going to start by sharing my screen here. Let's see. And you guys can see this now, okay, right? Perfect. Thank you. All right. Oh, wait, we got a couple more people coming in the waiting room. Let me let them in. Still getting used to this waiting room thing. There we go. All right, they should be able to get in now. All right, so to start out, my name is Nikki Caboose. I'm the VP of Development with Tech Hub South Florida. And this morning we have, oh, let's see, it does it again. I don't know why my slide does not let me go to the next screen. Let me try it again. Sorry, guys. I don't know why it does this to me sometimes. Nope, it's not letting me go to the next one. All right, well, I'm just going to talk then. All right, so
do you want me to share my screen real quick? Would that be helpful?
You can if you want, Monica. Yeah,
I could do that.
Yeah, because I don't know why it does that to me like every so often. It's funny how I can see some of you guys that are in the same room together. I like it. Got the whole crew. Thank you, Monica. Teamwork. There we go. Cool. Thanks, Monica. You can go to the next screen. Here we go. All right. So this morning, well, I guess this afternoon now, we have Michelle Bakels, lead developer and instructor at Boca Code, who's going to be giving us a workshop today on translating classes to functions in React. And we do have these lunch and learns every Friday from noon to 1. So of course, these are perfect for people that are learning to introductions to something new, upskilling, kind of trying to get an introduction to tech and coding, because we do a lot of these type of introductory classes. Go to the next screen. All right, building South Florida into a tech hub. That is our whole goal and mission as an organization. And our community creed. So Tech Hub South Florida is wholeheartedly committed to building a welcoming, collaborative and inclusive community for all. We put inclusivity first, engage with others, are considerate to all, and don't sell to people. So a little bit about our organization. We are a tech nonprofit 501c6 membership-driven organization. We currently have over 200 corporate members in our organization. Of course, once you add all the wonderful tech talent folks, we've got thousands of people here in our local South Florida community. These are a few of our corporate members, of course. Boca Code, we've got a bunch of the students with us this morning. Also, Emerge America's Office Depot, City Furniture, Modernizing Medicine, Carrier. I mean, there's a ton of great companies from our local startups all the way through enterprise level. A little on our membership. We have 4 different corporate membership levels, but each of them does offer customized profiles. We have different job listings, speaking opportunities, spotlights on our members, and of course, exclusive access to our peer groups as well, and a whole lot of other benefits. So if anybody's interested in membership, please let me know. You can reach out at Nikki at techhubsouthflorida.org, but I will drop that in chat as we go. And a little bit about our events. So we have quite a few things going on in an average week. We've got our tech talks that are Monday nights. We are actually getting back to doing these in person. So we're going to be taking it slow the first couple months. So May and June, we're going to have just 2 a month. The first one coming up will be at Boca Code, actually, on May 10th. So definitely check out our Eventbrite page. Again, we can drop that in chat because that will be the first one. We will be doing it hybrid so that you can actually log in through Zoom like normal, and there is going to be limited seating for those looking to do it in person. We have our community coffees or panel discussions, which we do alternating every other Tuesday. Our podcasts are also alternating every other Tuesday, where we highlight different business, startup, and tech leaders in our local community. And then again, of course, our lunch and learns every Friday, like we're doing now at noon. For those that are looking for a job, on our website under talent, there's a tab there that says talent. We do have a job board, but if for some reason you're looking through the job board, you say, I don't see something that looks perfect for me, but I really want to start getting my resume out, you can actually just go to the resume distributor, upload your resume, and that will actually kick it out to all of our members and then companies that have signed up to receive this service. And last but not least, if you'd like to join our Slack channel, it's techhubsouthflorida.org/Slack. I think we have just about 4,500 members on there now. And you can actually text us if you'd like to be added to our e-newsletters that go out every Monday afternoon. If you text us to 561-250-7206. And thank you again, Monica, for sharing your screen to help me out there. So I want to go ahead and pass the baton over to Michelle, who's going to be our instructor this afternoon. And Michelle, if you just want to start out again by telling us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and then feel free to take it away.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining. I just wanted to get this presentation set up really quickly. So I just started sharing my screen, and let me know if there are any issues. But so thank you again for joining. Today we're going to talk about translating classes to functions in React. A little bit about me. Okay, so my name is Michelle Bakels. I am a lead developer and instructor at Boca Code. I also serve as the vice chair for Code Palm Beach, which is a nonprofit that helps to teach or provide coding lessons to students in South Florida. And I also serve as the co-chair for the Palm Beach Tech Women's Council peer group. Before this, I was a software developer for NextEra Energy Resources for a few years and an instructor for Girls Who Code. And it was while I was at NextEra Energy that I learned React. I learned React on the job. It's not something that I walked in knowing, but they were moving towards that framework for web application development. So learned JavaScript and React with the company and got to write React code with them for a few years before coming to Boca Code, where I actually get to teach React among many other things to our students here. So just an overview briefly of what we're going to talk about today. I know not everybody probably uses React or uses React yet, or is even a software developer. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about what is React, what are the tenets of React, and then this presentation is really about components. So we're going to go over the different types of components, classes, and functions, and then walk through some of the steps briefly on how to translate components, and then actually go ahead and translate a component and see how it works and what it looks like. So one of the reasons why I find this conversation important for developers, for React developers in particular, of course, is that the React core team at Facebook announced a few months ago that they are moving all of their documentation, rewriting it into a functional hooks first documentation format this year. We should expect that to come out this year. So originally React was introduced where all components that had life cycle and state were written as classes. Now you can have functional components with life cycle and state using hooks. And that seems to be where the team is directing their efforts for the future of React. So in addition to understanding the documentation that's going to come out, understanding how these different components are used and written will help you understand components in React better in general. And then, of course, I think probably the most relative and important, in my opinion, is the ability to understand the years of class-based documentation that's online and available, and being able to apply it to new functional components and products that are written with predominantly functional components and hooks. So when I first started learning React at Nextera, this was kind of just on the precipice of the community, the React community moving towards the functional components. So when I first started, we started a brand new application at Nextera. We began writing it with class components and lifecycle methods. And very shortly after this project got started, they introduced functional components that could have lifecycle and state. So because we were early on in the project, not that you have to do this, but because we were early on in the project, we translated quickly our previous work into functional components. However, everything that we looked up online, if we needed to figure out how to do something or how something worked, was all written still class-based. And there's all kinds of Stack Overflow answers online that are still class-based. And if you don't know how to translate something from a class to a function, you are kind of denying yourself the opportunity to reference all of that great material that's out there. So that's kind of the reason why I wanted to put together this presentation. So briefly going over what is React, just very high level. It's a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And that's it, very plain and simple. It's declarative, meaning that instead of explicitly telling the machine what to do and how to do it, you kind of describe or you tell kind of React what to do or what you would like to happen in your user interfaces. React handles the actual manipulation of the DOM, as we'll go over, or basically what's being rendered in your web browser. It's also component based. So components are one of the major tenets of React. They're the building blocks of React applications. I kind of think about them similarly to Legos, where you kind of stack them, build them together, and put them together and build something. So the last major tenet is it's tech stack compatible. So being that React is only used for building user interfaces, you can use all kinds of other technologies with React that support its use. Sometimes people criticize React because it doesn't have enough. But I think if you look at some of the statements made by the React core team, this is very intentional. They don't want to add in their own component library. They don't want to add in their own routing library because they want to give the users or the developers, I should say, the opportunity to choose their own libraries for those things, depending on their use cases. So all they handle is the user interface itself, which gives us as developers a lot of flexibility when we're building our projects to choose exactly the libraries that we want to use for our use case. So one of the important features of React is this concept of the virtual DOM, or virtual document object model. And so if you're not familiar with the document object model, or the DOM, it's basically the structure of the web page. And you can kind of think about it in this tree shape form where each of the elements on your page are these nodes, or represented by these circles here. So oh, I forgot to update the text. Okay, nice copy pasta issue there. But anyway, so the way that this process of reconciliation works, with the virtual DOM is that instead of every time something changing on a web page, re-rendering the entire page, it identifies exactly what was changed and only changes just that one thing or that part of the application that needs to be changed. So here is a little example where we have this one small, this tree represents our web page, and just one part of our web page has changed, indicated by this green dot. And the process begins as such where we mark that element, and then we find if there are any descendants or children of that element, we mark those as well. And once we know exactly what we need to re-render, React will compute the difference between what's in the browser DOM and what has been actually marked to be changed. So when we do our re-rendering, we're only re-rendering the section that has changed. We're not always re-rendering the entire page every time one thing has changed. So that's the basics of the virtual DOM and this process called reconciliation. Another major tenet is JSX and the separation of concerns. So JSX is a syntax extension to JavaScript that combines JavaScript and HTML. So JSX, from what I've heard and in my experience, can be one of the most jarring features of React if you've never used React before. In most web development, you keep separate your JavaScript from your HTML and your CSS, or whatever you're using to style your components. But in React, you can put them all together. So what this did was it kind of flipped on its head this idea of the separation of concerns. So previously in web development, the separation of concerns is that you separate like things from each other, you kind of silo those things. And the way that it was treated before was that you would separate based on the technology. So you would separate your HTML from your CSS, from your JavaScript, and you would keep those things in different files in different places. React was like, separation of concerns shouldn't actually focus on what you're coding with so much as what you're coding for. So we'll put the JavaScript and the HTML together in a single file if they're used together to, do something as a cohesive unit, like maybe build an application form or show an image carousel or something like that. We'll put it all together instead of having to build out 3 separate files for each little thing. We can keep it all together. And that way we also kind of keep our code base from becoming too bloated or from getting really big really fast, where you're creating all of these files just because you have to keep the technology separated. So then we have components and props. So these are kind of the foundation of React in a sense of how things are built and how they are used. So components are the independent reusable pieces of UI. So when we talk about React being a library to build user interfaces, these user interfaces are built from components. And like I said before, you can kind of think about them in the same sense as like Legos or building blocks. So then props are the inputs that go into the component. So we're going to actually start here kind of towards the bottom of our example here, but we have this code react dom.render. So it is getting passed 2 parameters, element and document.get element by ID root. So what this is doing is it's saying take this, whatever element is, and render it to the root, which is basically the root of the web page here. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at what element is, and this is a variable that's holding, it's a JavaScript variable that's holding the value of a React component. So this is how you would call a React component that you have built someplace, is you would use this syntax. It's very similar to HTML with the angle brackets. You call the component, and here name equals Sarah. That is what the prop is. And this is how you pass props to a component. up here, function welcome with props here being passed as the argument, that's the actual component definition. So that's where it's defined once, and then you can use it anywhere, like we're using an element here. And so here we're returning a header one element that says hello, and it says props name because it'll take whatever comes in through the props that has the property of name, the key of name. And here in this example, it's Sarah, so it'll say hello, Sarah, in an H1 element, and that is what we'll render on the screen. Another important concept to understand in React is this idea of state. So state is simply an object where you store the values for your props, and it belongs to the component. So one component so a component will have state, and that state only belongs to that component. A state cannot be shared between two components. And if you ever need to share the values from a state with another component, you pass them through via props. So here's a little diagram. The components are these blue blocks, and we have props that get passed down, and you can see that props get passed down in this waterfall style. They go from a higher component and they go down. Props do not move up, they only move down. And then you can see here that the state is kind of this cycle that runs in the component individually, and you don't ever pass that state. So since we're translating components, let's talk about what components we're going to be working with. So when React was kind of originally introduced, it was introduced with class components. And this was the original way to write the React components that needed specifically to handle life cycle and state. So things that happened during the duration of using this component, and then the values that belong specifically to this component. So if it needed life cycle and state, then the component needed to be written as a class. And the way that you would write it is the same way that you would write a JavaScript class. So here we have an example. If you're familiar with object-oriented programming or classes, then this will look very familiar to you. You have your class defined as person here. It extends component, right? And you have a constructor, which we're very familiar with. We have our super method, which is going to be used to take props from another component that might be calling person. And then you set your state here with this object. You have a key in here, my state, with the value of true. And then below here, we have a render method that we need to use in order to actually render the component. And this is returning some HTML. We could also include JavaScript in here as well. This is where the JSX magic happens right here in this render method. So component lifecycle, when we talk about component lifecycle, they're the life cycle that can be monitored and manipulated in a component. So whatever can be watched or changed in a component is part of the life cycle. So it happens during three main phases, which are mounting, updating, and unmounting. So you have the initialization that occurs when the component is being initialized, but then when it's actually being rendered, that's when we're mounting it to the screen. Essentially, we can think about it like that, the document object model, the DOM. So we're mounting it to the DOM, we're mounting it to the screen. That is one part of the life cycle. The next part is updating, when things change, how we're handling the changes. And last is unmounting. So when it actually gets torn down, when we actually destroy the component, when we no longer need to view it, or when we no longer need it to be part of our DOM. So this is a chart that one of the members of the React core team, Dan Abramov, made. And this kind of describes a bit how you handle mounting, updating, and unmounting with lifecycle methods. The three main lifecycle methods are component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. And basically, component did mount is where you would put everything that you want to happen while the component's mounting. Component did update is where you want whatever code to run when you are actually changing something. in the DOM or on the page, however you like to describe it. And then component will unmount is where you would put whatever code you want to run when the component is being destroyed. A lot of times this one doesn't get used as much, but it does get used if you want to do something like destroy the state. That's the most common use that I've seen, is destroying a state before removing the component from the DOM. And the thing about these lifecycle methods is that each can only be used once in a component. And as we'll discuss in a little bit, this kind of presents a bit of a problem for us as developers. So each component can only have one method of component did mount or component did update, component will unmount, and everything that you would need to happen regardless of what's happening in the component or what it's related to would somehow need to be fit into these lifecycle methods, which can be quite difficult. So there were always functional components in React as well, but they had a bit of a different purpose, or singular purpose, I should say, earlier on. So you could always write a functional component in React that makes use of JavaScript functions. However, functional components did not handle state or life cycle. So this is a very simple example of a functional component where we're just, again, printing out someone's name. But having the functional component not handle state or life cycle could be a bit problematic for us as developers too, because imagine that we are writing this functional component and it's, maybe our requirements are changing, or maybe the code's not unfolding the way that we thought it would. Now we do need to have state or life cycle in our functional component. Now we need to rewrite this functional component as class. And also, kind of when we had functions versus classes in our repositories, it was the convention to have in different directories the functional components and the class components. So it wasn't necessarily just about translating the component, but now you have to move it in your directory structure as well, which, that's a toss up if it's going to cause a lot of problems or not. Like, you might be using that function in different places and now you have broken paths everywhere. So it could kind of be a pain to have to translate those as soon as you're like, oh man, I need state. I didn't expect to need state, but I need state now. So some of the pitfalls of class components. There is this confusion around this reference. So just like we're familiar with in classes, we have this keyword this, and that is a reference to whatever it is exactly here in this component that we are referring to. So because of this, we would have to have, all of this kind of verbose code that was, this dot state, meaning state that belongs to this class, equals this. And when we would run functions, it might not be necessarily so certain exactly what was going into that function, what was getting run in that function. So in the constructor for our class component, we had to do this kind of process of binding our methods. So for every single method of our class that we want to write, we have to write this dot on change text equals this dot on change text dot bind this. And that's all that it is. It never changes. You have to write that for every single method. And it's really verbose. It bloats your code pretty quickly. So that can get a little bit confusing as well. It's difficult to extract functionality and refactor. As I mentioned before in the example of, what if all of a sudden your functional component needs lifecycle? What do you do? There's also, classes, they encapsulate a lot of information, methods, instructions, things like that. So if you're ever to the point where your component's really growing and you want to break it out, because that's really one of the benefits of React, is to be able to break things up into smaller chunks and like build them up together, then it can be quite difficult to extract that functionality if you're using all classes. Again, separate event handlers are needed for related concerns. So all all of your, regardless of what you're doing or what you're working on, if it's just something that needs to be updated in that class, it all has to go in component did update, regardless of whether or not they're related. So you're running this method for whatever changes, and then you kind of got to layer in this conditional logic to check for just the thing that you changed just that one time as opposed to something else. So we also have kind of like our wrapper hell, as they refer to it. You have a component that uses some props or information. Then you realize you built this other component that's very similar, but it's also using the props, but it's a little bit different. So then you kind of create this higher order component where you can wrap whatever components are similar, whatever you can basically pass a component into a function that is called a higher order component, and pass the information to each of those components by calling it like this. So my component would be using this higher order component called with user information, and we would be passing my inner component or whatever other component is going to use that same data. And that would be kind of how it would be handled, but it creates these layers of complexity in our document object model that don't necessarily need to be there, and rids that problem now that we have hooks and functional components. So the new functional component provides state. It handles lifecycle with hooks. So no more component will unmount or anything like that. Now you have hooks. It's more lightweight. So typically when you're writing a functional component, you tend to use less code. I mean, just the fact that you don't need a constructor at all, that usually takes down a lot of code. And it's 100% backward compatible. So if you have a React project right now that's all class-based components, you can write your next component as a functional component and it won't break anything. There's no breaking changes. So if you want to start writing things as functional components and take advantage of hooks, you can do so without having to go back and refactor your entire program. So that, I think, is a huge benefit of and a huge draw to be able to start using functional components. So going quickly into what hooks are, they're simply just functions that allow you to hook into the React state and give you lifecycle features. And there's only two rules. They can only be used at the top level. So you can't put them in conditionals, you can't put them in loops, you can't put them in other JavaScript functions, and they can only be called from React functions, not pure JavaScript functions. That's it. Otherwise, you can use them however you need. And some of the benefits of hooks include a better separation of concern with logic, lifecycle, and state, meaning that unrelated things don't all have to go in the same component did update. You can keep things that are related to each other in several different, maybe use effect hooks, and keep your code more readable and have less side effects. It supports the true nature of React and JavaScript, which is functional. JavaScript is not, it's weird to say naturally, but it's not naturally a class-based language. It's not object-oriented. Everything in JavaScript is a function. So it tends to be a little bit easier to use as a function. Also, we avoid this higher component wrapper hell where we don't need to have these unnecessary DOM elements to kind of share props. And generally, as I mentioned before, it allows us to write things with less code. So before we jump over to the IDE, I'm just going to go over a couple quick rules so that you're familiar with what we're looking at when we go there. So translating the components, changing the component definition, you'd simply go from class my component extends to just simply writing the function. Remember, it has to stay capitalized. React functions must be capitalized. Or you could use the big arrow notation. So that's generally how you would translate those. Changing state. You go from having this constructor where you set your state to using what is called these use state hooks or state hooks, right? And so here it actually looks like a little bit more code, but when you have bigger states, you start to have things that are unrelated all in the same state. So remember, state is just an object. We can see that here with the curly braces. It's just an object. Our count is a counter related to somebody's name? Probably not, right? And yet they belong to the same object. This is not very natural, right? So here we can actually create several states in a single component, and we can separate them based on, maybe what they're related to. Maybe this might not be name or set name, it might be user, and it could have an object instead of a string here that has all the user's information. So we can create several states in a component now and keep them separated based on what they relate to. And you simply initialize the value of the state here with inside of the parentheses instead of here, like you would in an object. Setting state, instead of calling this dot set state and then referring to what part of the state, you just call the setter that you defined in your state hook. And then when you're passing props to the component, you no longer need this constructor and the super method. You simply pass them through the component definition. And using the props, instead of this.state.count, you don't need the this.state anymore. You can simply just refer to the item in the state. Keeps things a lot cleaner. And now we get to the lifecycle methods. So we had component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. All three of those can now be replaced with just an effect hook, just use effect. And in this one example, it looks like it's actually a little bit more complicated until you see kind of a few more examples of how this actually works. So use effect takes this callback, and this is where you would do whatever you need in this lifecycle moment, right? And the reason why this use effect in particular represents component did mount is because here as a second parameter, or sorry, a second argument in our use effect, we have these empty square brackets, and keeping those square brackets empty tells React that I want this effect hook to run when the component's mounted. Now, if we want to update a counter in our component, again, same structure for the use effect hook, but now we're subscribing to the counter in our state. And now it's just watching in the state, does the counter change? If it does, then we'll run this effect hook. Before, you would have component did update, and then you would have to compare the previous counter to the current counter. And if they were not the same, then you would run it. And you can see that this can be quite complicated. And imagine if you have more items in your state that you need to do this kind of conditional checking on, it can really blow your code. Now you have component unmounting. It's again, in this one example, it looks a little bit more complicated in the use effect, but really to indicate component unmount, you simply add this return callback with the empty brackets, and that is how you indicate to React that that's something that should happen on unmount. So essentially all of these lifecycle methods get replaced with a use effect hook. And also the use effect hook, you can have as many use effect hooks as you like, so you can create them to kind of handle more specific cases. You don't have to lump all of your logic together. So component functions, you don't need this constructor, you don't need to have your manual method binding here. All you need to do is just where you would have had the method in your component, just add function, that's all. And rendering, you don't need the render method anymore, you can simply use a return. So I'm going to try and quickly go over to my IDE and we'll run an example. So I have this little to-do app, right? And you can remove and add items. So if I were going to update this app that I have over here to change it from having the to-do list listed as a class to a functional component, I would open up the file here. I have my to-do list. My personal practice is that I copy the component I comment it out, and then underneath, I'll paste the new component, or I'll paste the copy of the component, and this is the one that I'll actually work on, because sometimes you need to like kind of reference the class as it was when you're trying to translate it. But we'll just go through this really quickly. Class now becomes function. We don't need extends component anymore. We just need our parentheses. The constructor can go. We don't need super props. And now for our state, we're going to create a new state hook. So we'll have const items. We'll create the setter, set items. Oh gosh, equals use state. And we're going to give it the initial value. That's the same here of the empty square brackets. I'm going to make sure, it's covering the screen a little bit. So I'm just going to make sure that I have imported here, use state. So now I don't need this. We don't need to do any method binding. So get rid of all of that code. Add item is a class method, so we'll just add function there. We don't need this anymore. We don't need this anymore. And I'll go down to this one and remove it here. And now the set state is a little bit trickier. So I'm just going to, again, copy it and then comment it out so I can reference it, paste it down here. And instead of, actually, I'll take that out. So instead of the set state, we'll do set items. It takes a callback. So we're going to have previous items that represents the array that we already had. And we're going to say previous items dot concat to add our new item to our items array. And I can't really check the chat right now, but if anybody can answer why we use concat instead of push here to add the items to an array in React, I'll mail you some Boca Code stickers. So moving down, delete item, we're going to make it a function and remove this dot state here. And we'll rewrite this state setter. So set items is just going to be filtered items. Instead of having this entire thing here, we can delete it. We don't need render method at all. And we don't need this here. And I'll skip down to here first. We don't need this. And we don't need this. So last thing that we need to handle is our ref. So we are going to use a hook called useRef. And I'll just import it up here. And then down here, I'll say const, I'm calling it input element equals use ref, and I'll give it an initial value of null. And then down here, I will delete all of this code and then just say input element. And then one last thing is that I have to handle its new kind of properties. So I'm going to add current here and dot current here. And lastly, hopefully I didn't miss any instances of that, and delete this code. Save. I think we got everything, and refresh. Moment of truth. Yep, still works perfectly. And just as another note, this functional component calls another component called to-do items that is written as a class, and it's still working perfectly. No issues with using the class component that is called by to-do list. So there we go. That is translating a React class into a functional component. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back and join y'all.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I am looking to see, let's see. Oh, Jonathan just had a comment in there. It says concat or push work as well with any questions post here. Okay. So yeah, does anybody have any questions about anything that Michelle was going over or needs any clarity on anything? Guess not. I was gonna say Tracy, just come and Michelle, that was so clear. So good job. She also asked, could you share the presentation? Is there anything that you can send out, Michelle?
Yeah, I'll fix my copy paste problems first so that I can share.
Okay. Great, awesome. With Todd. But yeah, so thank you so much, everybody. And of course, thank you, Michelle. Obviously, you did a wonderful job. And yes, if anybody has any questions, oh, there you go, Todd. Todd just put in the Boca Code website right there in the chat, and then also a phone number so you guys can reach out directly if you have questions or need some more information. And if for some reason you guys have other questions about Boca Code, about Tech Hub, anything, or anywhere you guys would like to be connected or additional resources, please feel free to reach out to us as well at Tech Hub. But yes, thank you again. And hopefully you guys all have a wonderful rest of your afternoon and of course, a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, Nikki.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you,
Michelle.
Nikki.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.